Hello there, folks, and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's Global Summit 12 presentation of We Should Have Seen It Coming, From Reagan to Trump, a front row seat to a political revolution. I'm Ben Speg, and I'm the Vice President at the JES. In this program, which originally aired live on Monday, May 17th, 2021, the JES Global Summit Chairman Steve Scully interviews Gerald Seib, author and Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal, about the past, present, and future of the GOP. Before we get to the program, I'd like to thank all of our event sponsors: Erie Insurance, Erie News Now, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, WQLN Public Media, and the American Tapestry Project, and our Global Summit event partner, the City Club of Cleveland. And I'd like to remind you that you can access additional programs to stream on demand at jeserie.org, where you'll also find a wide range of publications, from reports, essays, timely writings, and more. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date on all JES content. And now, here's We Should Have Seen It Coming, From Reagan to Trump, a front row seat to a political revolution.
The bright mind tonight is Gerald Seib, who is able to really let you understand politics in a way that few journalists are able to do. He has done so as the Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, now serving as the executive editor, his weekly column, Capital Journal. Somebody who really understands the nuances of politics and public policy. And beyond all of that, he is just truly one of the nicest guys you would ever want to meet in Washington, D.C. And I'm proud to call him a friend. Gerald Seib joining us from his home in Chevy Chase, Maryland on this Monday to really kick off what I think is going to be a terrific week as we focus tomorrow on COVID-19 and Wednesday and Thursday with Karen Tumulty and Susan Page. So I think you're in for a real treat, but no better person to talk about politics and the Republican Party. His great book, We Should Have Seen It Coming, Understanding the 40 Years of Reagan to Donald Trump. On behalf of the Jefferson Education Society in Erie, Gerald Seib, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me, and congratulations to you, Steve, the 10th anniversary, and to the great lineup you guys have put together. I see a lot of friends in your lineup, so that must mean it's good. So
you're in good company.
Part of it. Thank you.
I want to talk about the book, but let's talk about where we are today, because we are old enough to remember Jimmy Carter as a Democrat, a one-term president. He couldn't get out of town fast enough and was persona non grata within the Democratic Party after that. George H.W. Bush, a one-term president. Many people felt that he had abandoned the conservative principles. He too had some real problems within the Republican Party in the 1990s. What's different about Donald Trump today? He left office, he was impeached twice, we had the insurrection of the Capitol, we had the worst pandemic in a century, and yet he still has a firm grip on the GOP. Why?
It's a good question, and an interesting question to me, because the book actually starts with the last year of the Carter presidency and the huge transformation that occurred when the country moved from Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan. And I also spent some time dealing with the one-term presidency of George H.W. Bush, who I consider to have been a really good president, and probably the one that I personally knew the best and the most. And his one-term tenure was kind of a mystery at the time, is still a little bit of one now. But you're right, they both faded away, essentially. And it was an open question about Donald Trump when he lost, and when he finally accepted defeat in January, whether he too would just fade away. And now I think we've seen enough, 4 or 5 months later, to see that that's not going to be the case. He's not going to fade away, has no intention of fading away. And as your question suggests, has enough punch and power at the grassroots of the party to keep himself alive. Why is that the case? Well, I think basically the reason is that both Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush were products of the party establishments. Carter of the Democratic Party, obviously, and George H.W. Bush of the Republican Party. And they accepted defeat as defeat for the party they represented and wanted to move on so that the party that they felt loyalty to could then find the next person in line. Well, Donald Trump doesn't really consider himself part of the Republican Party that he used to come into power. He, in fact, in many ways arrived to bust up that Republican establishment. He is somebody who has been outspoken against the people who represent that establishment, against the George W. and George H.W. Bushes, against the Cheneys, as we've seen in recent days. So I think in his mind, his crusade to transform politics from the Republican Party out is not over yet. It's just had a pause. And so I think he believes the Trump revolution, which is probably what he considers it to be, is still underway. So why should I quit now and turn power back to a party that I basically ran against in 2016?
Again, part of the narrative, the base of the Republican Party, and as you write in the book, the disappointment in the two Bushes for various reasons, the loss of John McCain and Mitt Romney, leading to the rise of John McCain, or leading to the rise of Donald Trump, that in 2015, many people considered a joke as he came down that escalator at Trump Tower. So what was happening within the Republican Party? What did Donald Trump see that others did not?
Well, that's, that is in many ways, Steve, the reason I wrote the book was to figure out the answer to that question. How did we all miss this? And I include myself in that category. One of the things I learned in 2016 was modesty and humility, if I didn't have it before, because I didn't see it coming. I didn't think the Republican Party would nominate Donald Trump, and I didn't think he could win if nominated. Both those things were obviously wrong. So clearly something had changed. The kind of the rules of the road that those of us who have covered this subject for all these years, and I covered the full 40-year arc of the book, we missed some change. What changed? Well, I think the first thing that changed was that the Republican Party that nominated Donald Trump in 2016 was much, much different than the Republican Party that nominated Reagan twice and that picked the Bushes and John McCain and Mitt Romney. If you go back over time, you see that the Republican Party morphed slowly but surely from basically what used to be called, and stereotypically to some extent, a country club party, into much more of a Main Street party, much more into what it now proclaims to be, which is a working class party. And I pulled out some statistics, which I cite in the book, just to make this point, that there's a demographic change in the Republican Party of some significance. And most of this demographic change happened in the last decade or so. If you go back to 2010, for example, 40% of Republicans were college-educated voters. By 2016, that had fallen to 33%. So it became a less educated party, more blue-collar, more working class. And as that happened, the party came to represent places where the economic prosperity was less than it had been previously. If you go back to 2008 and look at the period between 2008 and 2018, economic output in that 10-year period between 2008 and 2018 in districts represented by Democrats in the House rose 37%. Output in districts represented by Republicans during that same 10-year period was flat. So in other words, the economy was flatlining in Republican areas and growing in Democratic areas. Why was that? Well, the Democratic Party had become the party of the relatively prosperous blue corridors on the coasts and the high-tech communities around the country. And the Republican Party had become much more the party of the traditional manufacturing Rust Belt, if you will, the heartland of the country and rural areas, which simply didn't benefit as much from the global economy as the Democratic areas did. So that produced a kind of a feeling of resentment, a feeling that the global economy wasn't working for those people, those new Republicans. Free trade wasn't working for those people, those new Republicans. And the cultural and financial elites were not interested in helping them. And in fact, were someday, to some extent, looking down their noses at them. Donald Trump arrived and he sensed all of that. And he took advantage of it. He articulated what those people were feeling. He said, you're right to feel resentful, and I'm your man, I'm going to change something. And so I think in a nutshell, that's a very long way of saying Donald Trump understood the new Republican Party better than anybody else did.
If you go back in the C-SPAN video library and you look at some of the Donald Trump speeches in the 1990s or watch some of the Donald Trump interviews in the late 1980s, he's pretty consistent. No. Us versus them. We're being cheated by the Chinese and our trade is a disaster. We're being screwed by foreign countries. I mean, that's been a general theme for really 30 years of Donald Trump's public life.
Yeah, and it's sort of a politics of resentment. Interestingly, he was saying the same things about Japan taking advantage of the US in the 1980s that he started saying about China in the 1990s and 2000s, but the message was still the same. We're suckers, we're being taken advantage of. Our leaders are stupid and weak. They don't know how to be tough with the rest of the world. I do. And by the way, Donald Trump was saying this when he was a Democrat, which he was for a long while, when he was an independent, which he was for a while, and when he became a Republican. The message didn't really change that much. But Steve, there's an important additional element to that message, which became more prominent as time went on, and that was immigration. So in addition to saying we're suckers, we're being taken advantage of, the global economy and trade isn't working for us, there was an added element that became more and more prominent in the 5 or 6 years before he ultimately was nominated, which was, and immigrants are hurting you, Mr. and Mrs. Average American. That became a much more prominent feature of the Trump message. The rest of it was kind of consistent. Interestingly, one of the things I discovered as I went back through this period, this 4-decade period from Reagan to Trump, and tried to figure out, again, what happened to the conservative movement in the Republican Party. One of the things I saw in retrospect that I didn't appreciate at the time was how over and over again, establishment Republicans tried to get their arms around the immigration issue, tried to be true to that Reagan view of immigration as something that's good for the country, that's good for the economy, that's life-giving for the melting pot of America, and tried to basically stay true to that principle while still reforming the immigration system to deal with a huge influx of undocumented workers from the South and growing resentment of them. And they could never do it because the immigration reform plans they were trying to implement were being fought at the grassroots, the new grassroots of the Republican Party, where anything that looked as if it might be amnesty for undocumented workers already here was resisted and resisted mightily and with greater emotion and bitterness over time. So I think the fact that Republicans couldn't figure out how to deal with the immigration issue, or more precisely, tried and were stopped by the grassroots of their own party from enacting an immigration reform over and over again, told you that immigration was an important part of this message. And again, Donald Trump understood that better than just about anybody else.
This summit is virtual, but for those who are watching virtually, a reminder that there will be an in-person summit in November. And so hopefully you'll be able to participate in person, and appreciate the support that you're doing tonight by being part of this virtual summit. George W. Bush, by the way, Gerry Seib, is going to be in Erie for the in-person summit on November the 9th. And my question is, as you look at his presidency and this immigration debate in particular, that really became a defining moment. George Bush out with a new book saying it was one of his big regrets. How did that create such a fissure within the Republican Party?
Well, you know, it did create a fissure. And I think George W. Bush tried as hard as anybody in the long list of establishment Republicans to try to figure out how to get their arms around the immigration issue. It's ironic because when George W. Bush was running successfully for governor of Texas twice, he embraced immigrants. He embraced the Hispanic community. He got a larger share of the Hispanic vote than just about any other Republican in the country. He had a very broad-minded view of the immigration question, and he really thought that it was important for Republicans to get out ahead of the immigration issue and to basically enact an immigration reform that dealt with the dreamers, the young immigrants brought here by their parents through no action of their own, and that dealt with the legacy of 11 to 12 million undocumented workers already here, already working, already contributing to the economy, and that regulated a flow of immigrants across the southern border that was basically healthy enough in size to help the economy of the country without being something that would incite anger among people who thought the country was being overrun. He set out to do that because he thought it was the right thing to do, and he thought it was important for the Republican Party. I think what he discovered was what John McCain and Marco Rubio and even Mitt Romney discovered, which was, as I said before, the grassroots of his own party didn't want anything to do with an immigration reform plan that allowed undocumented workers already here to be given legal status, much less citizenship. And that became the amnesty plan. Amnesty became a dirty word. The Tea Party movement, talk radio, the new right, if you will, latched onto this and basically made sure that George W. Bush couldn't do it. What's interesting about, and I'm glad he's going to be in Erie, what's interesting about the former president's role here is that he has decided that he wants to remain true to that message. And that's really the Reagan message on immigration. And Ronald Reagan articulated that over and over again, including, as I noted in the book, in a going away interview I was part of with him on his second last day in office. After 8 years in the presidency, he was still saying, immigration is good for the country. Immigration gives life to the country. We should embrace immigrants.
Would he be welcome today in the Republican Party as a presidential candidate, George W. Bush? Could he?
No, I don't think so. Not with the Reagan message that he articulated in 1980 and 1984. Certainly some elements of that message would be embraced. Certainly the tax cutting element of it. To some extent, the defense part of it, but not the immigration part, not the free trade part, and not even the robust internationalism that he stood for, which was very much of a Cold War kind of internationalism. But it was Ronald Reagan's belief that America was the shining light for the rest of the world and ought to be out on the world stage, transforming the world. That would not be particularly resonant in the Republican Party today. So, I look at that Ronald Reagan and I seriously doubt he could be nominated in the Republican Party today.
The book titled, We Should Have Seen It Coming, From Reagan to Trump. Let's talk about Northwest Pennsylvania, because you talk about the shifts within the Democratic and Republican Party. Erie County is a swing county in a swing state. It had gone Democrat for more than 2 decades. It flipped Republican in 2016 for Donald Trump, flipped back to Democrat for Joe Biden in 2020. Does that tell you that there is a realignment within the two political parties, or was that just an aberration?
No, there's a realignment for sure, but that realignment leaves some swing areas, and Erie is certainly one of those swing areas that continue to move or can continue to move back and forth between the two parties. But I think the realignment of the parties is very real and ongoing. And in a way, and I'll show you, there's an interesting chart that we did at the Wall Street Journal a few years ago, and I reference this in the book. And I wish I'd printed it out and brought it with me, but I think it, more than anything I can think of, it is the realignment of the two parties in one picture. If you go back to the early 1990s and you take two groups of voters, white women with a college degree and white men without a college degree, and put those two people on a voting spectrum, and they voted almost identically in the early 90s, which is to say they were just slightly right of center, slightly more Republican than Democratic, but pretty much in the middle of the spectrum. Then you go take those groups through the ensuing years up to 2016, and the two lines go like this. White women with college degrees become plus 40% Democratic voters. White men without college degrees become almost plus 40% Republican voters. So you have two groups that kind of are personifications of the two new versions of the two parties. The Democratic Party is much more female than male, much more college educated than not. The Republican Party is much more male than female and has a much bigger contingent of non-college working class white voters in particular and men in particular. So that is the transformation of the two parties in a nutshell in my eyes. And that has a geographic component as well, because as I said before, that kind of, those demographics translate into Democratic corridors on the two coasts and in the Northeast, and a giant Republican sort of land, if you will, a nation within the nation almost, in the center of the country where I'm from, in Kansas, and the Southeast. So you have a big demographic shift that also happens to correlate with significant geographical shifts in the party's strengths. Now, it's important to note when you say that, and we saw this in 2020, there still are the Joe Bidens of the world, and there aren't very many Democratic candidates or Republican candidates who can cross over and appeal to the other side, but Joe Biden happens to be one, and he may have been the only Democrat running in 2020, certainly of the most serious candidates who could have pulled that off, but he did. And there are some Republicans who can still reach out, and Mitt Romney is probably one, who could appeal to some of those moderate voters who turned away from Donald Trump, those suburban white Republican women that I referred to. But there aren't very many of those politicians left. There are still swing areas, but to swing them, you need to be a politician who isn't as polarizing as, say, a Bernie Sanders on the left or a Donald Trump on the right has turned out to be.
Well, let me take that one step further and use Erie really as the laboratory, the microcosm, because those numbers that you just outlined are almost identical to what we saw in the vote count in Erie, Pennsylvania, and Erie County in 2016 and 2020. And so now we're seeing a debate within the Democratic Party between the more moderate wing, the Joe Biden wing of the Democratic Party, and obviously the more progressive wing. And if you understand, those so-called Reagan Democrats, they're progressive, but maybe not to the level of AOC. So
Yeah.
for voters in Erie who are moving from industrial to service sector economy, what do the Democrats need to do? How do they address that realignment?
Well, I write about this some in my column tomorrow. I'm not
Please
flashing
do.
my own column here, but I'll because I tried to address the question of whether Democrats are overplaying their hand right now, whether they're overreading their mandate. Joe Biden won the popular vote fairly comfortably, but he barely won some of the swing states that he needed to get the Electoral College count. 60 or 70,000 votes in the right places that had gone the other way. Donald Trump would have been reelected. They lost seats in the House, and they basically won an even split in the Senate. Only, I would argue, and most would argue, because then President Trump's controversies about the outcome of the 2020 election helped swing two Georgia seats to the Democrats. So it was not a rousing, and by the way, Democrats also lost ground in state legislative races. So it wasn't a rousing mandate, yet Democrats are using that thin mandate to try to do big things. $6 trillion in stimulus spending, and infrastructure spending, in jobs creation spending, and some big social and cultural changes. And what I'm saying in the column, which I believe it to be the case, or I wouldn't have written it, I think Democrats believe, and I think they're probably right, that actually they're on fairly solid ground with the middle of the country on the economic agenda. That I think the coronavirus pandemic left people not only in an economic hole in many cases, but also thinking that the country needed to spin forward, that there needed to be more government help to rebuild the country now and to address some long-term problems. And that to the extent that part of the Biden agenda is out and is being pushed by Democrats, they're not getting a lot of traction with Republicans in Congress, but I think they're in reasonably good shape with the country at large on those kinds of issues. I think where they're not in good shape are some of the cultural issues, the defund the police, the immigration issue we talked about earlier, the kind of cancel culture that's become so much a part of the Democratic progressive left. Those issues, I think, scare some middle of the road voters, the kind of people who like Joe Biden, but don't like that part of the Democratic message. So that's where I think Democrats have some problems. And I quote in the column Ro Khanna, who's a progressive Democrat in the House, one of the leaders of the House Progressive Caucus, saying exactly this. I think we've won the economic argument. Where we're in trouble as progressive Democrats is when we make people think that we don't love this country, we don't appreciate the Constitution, that we're interested in suppressing people who don't agree with us, and that we're not supportive of law enforcement or the military. That's where we progressive Democrats, get into trouble, and that feels about right to me.
And of course, that is magnified, as you know, through our media today that now has so many different silos, and the polarization and opinion journalism, and whether it's Fox or MSNBC or One America News or websites that you go to, further dividing, I think, the country. And we hear it, and I did the show this morning, and the division among our callers is palpable today.
Well, and Steve, it's not just the division, it's like outrage on all sides. I mean, there is a kind of a perpetual outrage machine at work in this country now, and it includes social media platforms, it includes cable news networks, it includes political consultants who make hay by making voters mad, not by educating them or convincing them, but by making them angry at the other side. And we've gotten to a point where politics, I think, is defined in this country much more by who you are against than what you are for. And to go back to the Donald Trump, why is Donald Trump still a leader, if not the leader of the Republican Party? I think part of it is that his supporters identify with him because of who he's against more than what he is for. He's against liberals and Democrats, and it will attack them harder and harsher and louder than anybody else. And that's enough, because I'm not sure that a lot of those Trump supporters could tell you what substantive policy positions he takes, except being a hardline on immigration, that make them Trump supporters.
Back to the book. Why was Sarah Palin, her selection as John McCain's running mate, a precursor to Donald Trump?
It's interesting because I cite people who, in retrospect, were precursors to Trump that should have told us that this change was coming. And in my mind, they start with Pat Buchanan, who was very, very much like Donald Trump as far back as 1992. In fact, Bill McIntyre, a Republican pollster who has done polling for us at the Wall Street Journal and NBC News for years, once referred to Donald Trump as Pat Buchanan with his own airplane. So you had Pat Buchanan, you have Ross Perot, you had Sarah Palin, and these were all populist politicians in the Republican Party. Although honestly, you could throw Bernie Sanders and Occupy Wall Street in there as well. Basically, that told us, or should have told us, that there was a populist streak running through the country, in particular running through the Republican Party, that it was getting wider. And we tend to forget, because Sarah Palin, ultimately floundered and was seen as a mistake, that she was an absolute rock star for a short period of time in that John McCain campaign period in 2008, in which she was electric. She was filling stadiums. She was generating more excitement than John McCain, the actual nominee. And why was that? Because she was presenting a kind of a folksy, working class, every woman a message and persona that was striking a chord in the Republican Party. And a lot of her appeal was simply anti-establishment. I'm not from the Republican establishment. I know they look down their noses at me. I don't care. I'm, in that respect, like you, average Republican voter. And that was very electric. And if she had been a better candidate, and probably, frankly, a more experienced candidate before she got thrown into the deep end of the swimming pool, she would have really taken off. And that experience should have told us that she was speaking to a new Republican Party.
And as you know, politics is about addition. It's not about subtraction. And yet, if you look at where Donald Trump is today, he still seems to be dividing and subtracting rather than adding. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is, and I think this is one of the problems with Donald Trump continuing to be seen as the leader of the Republican Party, or the rest of the Republican Party hitching its wagon to Donald Trump. He turned off a lot of voters. That's why he lost the popular vote by 7 million to Joe Biden. He turned off more voters with the way he handled a post-election period. I think the January 6th uprising at the Capitol genuinely scared a lot of voters, including people who, in many cases, who voted for Donald Trump. So you have, I think, a hardcore Trump support base, which is big and significant. But as you suggest, it hasn't been added to since he lost the election. It's probably been subtracted from. And I think, to the extent other Republicans look at the Trump phenomenon and say, well, we should take the lessons of Donald Trump and find a better messenger to convey them, I think those people are really onto something. I think it's problematic to take Donald Trump himself and think you can carry that forward 4 or 8 years down the road because of all the Trump baggage that he brings onto the playing field. But I do think Republicans have figured out, and you can. There's a fairly long list of people who have absorbed this message, and there would also be interested in running in 2024. That you have to appeal to the Trump base while not turning off people who ought to be added to that Trump base. Right now, the Trump base is as solid as ever, but it seems to be self-limited to that Trump base.
I'm going to ask you a question from my own personal experience, and I know you've had these conversations with the former president as well. But having covered here in Washington the presidencies from George H.W. Bush all the way through to Donald Trump was the most accessible president to the media, bar none. He was accessible in terms of photo ops, in terms of press avails, in terms of returning phone calls to people like you, in terms of interviews. And my question is, does that surprise you? And in answering it, your own interactions with the former president when he was in the White House, often calling you?
Well, it did surprise me, although it shouldn't have. I mean, Donald Trump has a symbiotic relationship with the press, with the media. He always has. He did throughout his time in New York. He did with the Wall Street Journal as a business publication in New York when he was a businessman, not a politician. He's very much of the New York media environment, where there's this constant interplay between celebrities and sources and the media infrastructure in New York. That's the milieu he's from, and he's comfortable operating that way. He was certainly that way in the campaign in 2016. And you tell people that he remained that way as president, they don't believe it, because what most people absorbed was the constant feuding between Donald Trump and his administration and people in the press. What they failed to note is what you just said, which is that Donald Trump continued to mix it up with the press constantly. And in part, it's because Donald Trump's view of the world is that it's important for me to be at the center of the conversation. That's true whether the conversation is positive toward me or negative toward me. The important thing is that it be about me. And so if that means creating controversy, even if the controversy puts you in a bad light in the short term, that's still better than having the spotlight be on somebody else. I mean, that's just kind of his personality. It's the way he operated in New York for 40 years before he got into politics. It's the way he's still operating today, frankly. And what that translates into is, as you suggest, a lot of accessibility. I can think of one example. I did a piece. Actually, it was an excerpt from this book ran in the journal in August when the book came out. Maybe it was July, the summer of 2020. In any case, and the excerpts of the book talked about how Donald Trump had changed the Republican Party and there was no going back now. That was the passages of the book that I excerpted. And it wasn't entirely favorable to President Trump by any means. It talked about all the downsides that fact created and would create for Republicans. But the important point of the excerpt was that Donald Trump was a consequential president because he had changed his party in a way nobody else could have, which I believe to be true. So I'm here at my house, sitting out there at my breakfast room table on that Saturday when the piece came out, and my cell phone rang, and it was when you get a call from the White House, it says unlisted number or unknown number, and I picked it up, and the voice on the other end said it was the Marine who handles calls for the president on the weekend. Said, "Hold on for the president of the United States." So Donald Trump got on and he said, "Jerry, I just want you to know I read your piece this morning. I thought it was really great." I said, "Okay, well, thank you." So we proceeded to talk for about 10 minutes. And I, of course, did what any journalist would do, which is you took advantage of it to interview him for my next column for the following week. But that's kind of the way Donald Trump deals with the press. He wants to mix it up. It's not always pleasant. And often we are being used as a foil then and now still. But he wants to be in the conversation. He wants to be in the game.
One more question about the book, and then we're going to bring in some audience questions. So again, Gerald Seib, on behalf of the Jefferson Education Society and this virtual summit, thank you for joining us. When did you get the idea of the book? And I think you've answered the question, the title, but how did you come up with the title?
Well, I'll answer the title question first because I can take no credit for the title. So my agent, a wonderful guy named Rafe Segalin, and I were having lunch as I was about halfway through the book, and he asked, he's a smart agent because he knows what you need to do to be able to explain your book, to sell your book. And he said, "What's your bottom line? What's the message? What have you learned?" And I said, "Well, we should have seen it coming." And I then conveyed that sentiment onto the editor, my editor at Random House, who said, "Well, that should be the title of the book." And then we had a long debate about whether that's kind of an odd title for a book. But his view was, well, if that's the message of the book and it's a provocative message, that should be the title of the book. So it wasn't my idea. It was my agent and my editor at Random House who decided that would be it. And then in retrospect, I think it was I like the title now, obviously, because it does tell you what the message of the book is. My journey to writing the book was a little circuitous. I started out to write. The idea for the book came because of various columns I'd written in 2016, attempting to explain where Donald Trump came from, not in the mega way the book does, but in kind of bite-sized pieces. And I got particularly interested in 1979 as the year where politics really changed. That's when the country went from 40 years of liberal Franklin Roosevelt kind of rule through Carter's what many consider a failed presidency, to the Reagan Revolution. And all those switches turned in 1979, the year before Reagan was elected. You had 3 Mile Island, you had gas lines, you had stagflation, you had the invasion of Afghanistan. The world felt like it was falling apart. The door was open for Ronald Reagan and a conservative revolution that carried on all the way through Donald Trump. So I got very interested in 1979. And again, my editor at Random House convinced me that don't write about 1979, write about what began in 1979, which was the conservative revolution, and how did it evolve to where it is now. So that's where the idea came from. But it started with me trying to figure out for myself, frankly, which is one of the fun things a journalist gets to do, trying to figure out for myself, how did this happen? Where did this come from? And I'd identified the starting point, and my editor said, well, don't write about the starting point, write about the whole arc of the story.
Just a quick aside, Jerry Seib, we saw Richard Nixon winning 49 states in 1972 and Ronald Reagan in 1984. Will we see that again?
Not for a long time. I mean, we may see it again, but the country is so evenly divided right now. It is so polarized that the idea that Ronald Reagan could win states that, Vermont or Hawaii or states like that, any Republican, it just seems implausible right now. People are locked in, states are locked in. Every presidential election really since the 1984 reelection has been decided on in about 12 states. I mean, that's where the country's swing votes are. Everything else is locked in, red or blue. And those states change over time. Virginia has gone from red to blue. Arizona is probably in the process of going from red to blue. Ohio has probably gone from blue to red. Florida may be in the process of going from blue to red. But once states get locked in, and most of them are already locked in, they tend to stay there right now. And it's very hard for the opposing team to bring in a player who can carry the day in those states.
A lot of great questions. Let's get right to them. This is from one of our viewers and listeners. Will history be kinder to Liz Cheney or to the Republicans who support what he is calling, or this person is calling, the big lie? Of course, that's what Cheney is saying about President Trump.
That is the question of the week and the hour and maybe the year and maybe the decade. I don't know the answer, obviously. My guess is history is going to be kind to Liz Cheney. That does not mean that short-term politics are going to be kind to Liz Cheney. She is a woman without a party right now in many respects. And the party, not the nation, but the party is very much still sold on Donald Trump, as we were discussing earlier. So she is a person who's taken a principled stand that I think will look good in history and in retrospect. But at the moment, in the short term, she has to go find the way to plant a flag and have a crusade where she has some followers, and that is not clear. It's not clear right now. She's got more followers in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party right now. But there is a broad expanse of people in the middle in this country who just have to find somebody that they can follow, and maybe that person is a Liz Cheney kind of figure.
Another question based on the politics of Northwest Pennsylvania, Erie and Erie County. As you understand the demographics of the voters, again, this is a blue-collar community that is transitioning into a more service sector economy. Can you predict how you think a county like Erie will go in the midterm elections? Right now, it's a seat being held by a Republican, Mike Kelly, and looking ahead to 2024.
This is, I think, the great question. And I think Erie County probably encapsulates it as well as any place in the country. The great gamble that the Democrats are taking right now is that they are taking some positions on economic policy, which we discussed earlier, going big, going strong, trying to change the relationship between the government and the economy, and counting on that being successful in the short term, and counting on success in that effort breeding success politically, which is to say, the Biden team's calculation, the Democrats' calculation, is that going big, being controversial, going it alone without Republican support if need be, will pay dividends because the results will speak for themselves, that the economy will look as if, by the end of this year, the economy will look as if it's recovered from the coronavirus hit. It will look as if it's on the way to a strong rebound. It will look as if in the process of recovery, important parts of the economy are being rebuilt and refurbished and improved, and that success will breed success at the ballot box, and that swing areas that are kind of nervous about parts of the progressive surge in the Democratic Party that we discussed earlier will be sold because the results on the economic front will speak for themselves. Whether that's the way it looks in 6 months or 9 months or not, I think that's an open question. You know, we saw a little from the Biden administration's point of view, a little bit of a scare last week when consumer prices shot up somewhat unexpectedly, scared the financial markets and raised the specter that so much government activism, so much government stimulus money might spark inflation, drive up prices, and start to bring down the stock market and create an unvirtuous cycle in the economy. If that's what happens, the gamble is not going to pay off. If on the other hand, people feel in places like Erie County that Joe Biden and the Democrats have pulled the country back from the coronavirus onto a good track that's moving forward and in ways where the economy will be improved for the long run, that'll be a different scenario entirely.
This is a two-part question. Do you think Donald Trump runs in 2024? And without Twitter, how will he connect with voters? Will he revert to the classic media?
I think he will run. I don't know that. And by the way, immediately after the election, I wouldn't have said that, but everything he's done since the election tells you he's planning to run again.
He's on the campaign trail next month. He's in North Carolina, June 5th.
Yeah, what more do you need to see, right? So, and I think that as a footnote, I think there's an interesting question of whether, by saying he's going to run, whether he clears the field or not, or whether others, you know, you can pick your names, Mike Pompeo or Marco Rubio or Nikki Haley, whether they step aside or decide, you know, we're not just going to hand this nomination again to Donald Trump. But that's an aside, but I think that's an interesting question. And so, you know, I think he probably will run. I think if he doesn't have a social media platform, he'll try to create one with some success. And if that doesn't work, if that doesn't give him the size of megaphone that he wants, and he wants a very big megaphone, I can guarantee you he'll resort to calling cable morning news shows and just presenting himself as he did when he started out running for president in 2015.
I like this question. Reagan, at the end of the Cold War, really summoned forces nationally and internationally, calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, communism evil. The question is, what new forces are on the horizon that would unify a divided country?
I wish I knew the answer to that question, Steve. I think that's a very profound question. And, you know, you would have thought the coronavirus would have been that kind of force. And as we saw, regretfully, it was not only not that, it was in some ways the opposite of that. You know, the things that have traditionally unified the country are either an external threat or a charismatic leader. And I think some people thought Barack Obama would be the charismatic leader who could do that. And I think that didn't really work out. The external threat of the coronavirus doesn't really seem to do that. I think an actual hot conflict with China might do that, but I'm not sure of that. And unfortunately, I don't see the kind of Franklin Roosevelt like Ronald Reagan like charismatic figure who could pull it off by dint of force of personality. So I don't know the answer to that question, and I wish I did, and I wish there were something that you could count on to unify the country, but I don't see it, to be totally blunt.
Another question, Jerry Seib, on the chance that the progressive Democrats and their attitude towards what's going on in Israel, in particular in Jerusalem, will divide or tear the Democratic Party in half.
Well, look, there's a clearer division on Israel and the Palestinian conflict now than there's ever been, but it's not a new one. I think the Democratic Party has been divided on this question for some time now. It's probably more acute now because the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is stronger than it was before, and it is more pro-Palestinian and less pro-Israel than other parts of the Democratic Party. So the division is more acute now, but it's not new. I think it's probably not something that can tear the Democratic Party apart, simply because to most voters, it's just not that important. It is to activists. And I used to cover the Middle East. I lived there for 3 years. I wrote about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict endlessly for years, both when I was in the Middle East and when I was covering national security and foreign policy here in Washington. I'm deeply interested in it, and I think it's really important. I just don't think it's a front burner issue for most voters. So I think there's a tension in the Democratic Party. I think it's a more acute tension than it has been for ever, probably. but I don't think it's a kind of fundamental issue that can tear the party apart.
How do you think Joe Biden views his presidency? He is 78 years old. He had run twice before, served as vice president, 37 years in the Senate. So he's been around. He understands this moment. How do you think he views where he's at right now and how he wants to position his presidency over the next 3 years, regardless of whether he runs in 2024?
Well, it's a really good question. And you'd have to psychoanalyze Joe Biden probably more than I'm willing to fully answer the question. But I think two things, and I have thought about this question a lot. And part of this is based on what he says and does, and part of it is just based on having covered Joe Biden for a long time. I think two things. I think, first of all, he views himself, as he's always viewed himself, as somebody who's got a great feel for average people, for middle America, for average Americans, and that his feel for those Americans right now is that they have been through a coronavirus pandemic that was scary and harmful, and they want government help now in a way they didn't before they went through this searing experience. And that means that he is liberated to offer a sort of a much more aggressive agenda than he probably would have normally. And secondly, I think he views himself, and this is a surprise to me, as a kind of a transformational president, that he's going to basically be the latter-day version of Franklin Roosevelt, because I think he believes the country is at an inflection point where, for the first time really since Reagan defeated Carter, as we were discussing earlier, the country wants government to step up in a bigger way, and that he is the transformational president who's arrived at that inflection point and who's going to make that happen. And so I think he sees himself as a historic moment in a way that is a bit surprising if you think of Joe Biden as not that kind of maybe necessarily transformational figure, but I think he sees himself as such more than I would have guessed.
As you know, in Daniel Henniger, we used his column this morning as really the basis of our first hour on the Washington Journal. Are the Democrats destroying the American dream, in part because the $300 per week in unemployment benefits, the enhanced benefits, the additional child assistance, and that's the argument we're hearing from the Republicans and from the right.
Right, and I think that whether that's true or not depends entirely on where Americans are and how much they feel they are ready for a bigger government role in the economy than they've had for the last 4 decades, and whether that is different now than it was before, precisely because of the coronavirus experience, whether that has produced a different American mindset. I think clearly some voters are scared by this. As I said before, Democrats think they're on pretty solid ground on those quite aggressive economic positions. And there's some evidence in public polling, among other things, to support that view. I think the cultural issues are a potential Achilles heel. But again, the proof will be in the economic pudding on that question.
I want to bring it back to the regional politics, because you talked about Florida becoming more Republican, Ohio becoming more Republican. Why is Pennsylvania such a swing state? What is it about Pennsylvania that makes it one that can go back and forth? And we've seen this over the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Well, look, you as a native son, you probably know the answer to that better than I do. I have always thought, and we spent some time in Pennsylvania because one of my sons went to play baseball at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, right, sort of in the middle of the state. So we spent a fair amount of time there in recent years. I view Pennsylvania the same way I used to look at Ohio and Missouri, which is to say it has a little bit of everything in the country. It's got an eastern part of the state that looks a lot like Democratic country and the East Coast, and it's got a central part of the state that feels like kind of the middle of America swing districts, and it's got a western part of the state that feels an awful lot like the Southwest, very conservative and very working class in a kind of a Republican conservative sort of way. It has all the demographics of the country. It has all the economic elements of the grand American kaleidoscope economy all at play. It's got a high-tech part of the state in various places. It's got urban renewal and it's got urban decay. It has a little bit of everything. So I view Pennsylvania right now as kind of a microcosm of the country. And if you see the country, as you have to, as a country that's almost evenly divided in every way between the two parties, well, then of course that's where Pennsylvania would be. And that's pretty much where Pennsylvania is, as far as I can tell. And it's because it's a microcosm of the country.
Another question from another audience member wondering whether or not the divisions within the Republican Party will create a third party.
I get this question a lot. And my answer is, I think no. Now, it would appear, if you simply look in a clinical way at the state of politics in America, that the conditions ought to be ripe, if not perfect, for a third party. You have the Republican Party becoming more Trumpian, and we've talked about how that's self-limiting. You have the Democratic Party moving to the left and becoming more progressive in a way that scares some people in the middle. And you have the Liz Cheney's and Joe Manchin's, Liz Cheney, a Republican, Joe Manchin, a Democrat. And by the way, the business community increasingly, who are kind of standing in the middle between these two forces, feeling they don't have a home necessarily anymore, not one that's entirely comfortable. And a lot of voters who are there with them. That ought to be the precise formula for the creation of a centrist third party. The problem is that our system just simply doesn't allow that to happen very easily. And I spent a lot of time in the 1990s, and in fact, a lot of time in Pennsylvania in the 1990s, in Wind Gap and areas like that, writing about the Ross Perot Party, the Ross Perot independent candidacy in 92 and the Patriot Party in 96. And if anybody had a chance to basically crystallize that center of the country movement and sentiment and turn it into a third party, it ought to have been Ross Perot, a guy with basically an unlimited budget, a giant platform that then it was cable TV, CNN, and a lot of people around the country who wished him well, who wanted him to succeed in this, because they were tired then, as they are now, in many cases, of the two established parties. And he made a pretty good run at it. He got 19% of the vote in 1992. But that's about as good as you can do. And I just think the system is established and is run for two parties. And I think the way the American system adjusts to times like this, when it feels a little out of sync, out of whack, is the two parties morph to get to the place where the voters are. And that's what I think is more likely to happen. I think that you'll have to run through this cycle, and somebody or some party will figure out how to capture that sentiment in the center of the spectrum better than they are right now. And that'll be the party that prevails.
One of the common themes of Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump is that people underestimated their political skills, and to their demise. As you well know, Jimmy Carter was thrilled to run against Ronald Reagan, thinking it was going to be an easy election. Of course, we know what happened. I want to put one moment in perspective, and that is the Access Hollywood video comes out on a Friday. The Republican Party is going crazy because they're wondering if Donald Trump should be dumped from the ticket. There's a debate in St. Louis early the following week, and Donald Trump responds in part by bringing in those people who were linked to Bill Clinton, Juanita Broaddrick, and others inside that debate hall. The air came out of that room when they walked in there. I was there, you were there. Just as an example of how when Donald Trump is hit, he'll hit back even harder. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, and I think part of the explanation of why that works for Donald Trump is that he sees no reason to apologize or to give ground, because he sees those as signs of weakness. Most people think that they probably have to in a situation like that. He didn't, and he just decides to tough it out. And you have to have let's face it, you have to have incredibly thick skin to do that, to basically be impervious to criticism, to opposition, even to hatred. And he is. There were two moments in the 2016 cycle when I was convinced he wouldn't be nominated. First, when he wouldn't be nominated, and second, he couldn't possibly win. One was when he said John McCain was a loser because he'd been shot down and captured in Vietnam. And I thought, there is no way the Republican Party is going to nominate somebody who said that about John McCain, a past Republican nominee for president, and somebody who is widely acknowledged to be an American hero. I was wrong. People were prepared to accept that. And the second was the Access Hollywood tape. I thought, well, that is a bridge too far. And it turned out that I think in a way, because Donald Trump was willing to basically charge into those controversies, not shy away from them, charge into them and embrace the controversy, that it had a perverse appeal to his supporters who thought, wow, if he can do that, he's tough enough for anybody. He's tough enough for the Chinese. He's tough enough for the Russians. He's tough enough for the Democrats. And it worked to his benefit. And I think that was in large part because the anti-establishment feeling among his supporters and among a lot of other people who turned out to be his supporters was so strong, they thought somebody who'll take on the establishment and give no ground and make no apologies for it is my kind of guy.
Let me take two more questions. As I mentioned, I have some of my students from the University of California who are also participating, and this is from one of my students at UC Davis, and I'll read it exactly. What do you think of the continued politicization of coronavirus, how low vaccination rates among Republicans and thus more eventual cases lead to a change in the narrative?
I think that change in the narrative, I think that part of the narrative seems baked in at this point. I think there'll be slow erosion in the anti-vaxxing sentiment as more and more people see the wisdom of vaccinations. But I think that the coronavirus, and I think this is a sad thing to say, but I think the coronavirus is destined to remain a political topic, not a health topic. And I think that some of the anti-vaccination or at least vaccination hesitancy is not going to go away. And it is in that sense, is simply another manifestation of pretty widespread anti-establishment sentiment in this country, mostly in the Republican Party.
And even the idea of wearing a mask or not wearing a mask up until about a week ago was viewed as a political statement in some circles.
And who would have ever guessed, right? Getting tested, wearing a mask, and now getting a vaccination. Every step along the way has turned into a political flashpoint. And as I said earlier, I did guess that at the outset, the coronavirus would be the kind of shock that would pull people together. It's just not where the country's at.
I'm going to give you a heads up on my final question, which is the biggest surprise as you research the book, but a question from one of our audience members saying, if Trump does not really run in 2024, who does? You mentioned some names earlier, but if he doesn't run, hold on to your seat, right?
Yeah, there's probably be about 20 people, but Mike Pompeo, Josh Hawley, Nikki Haley, Tom Cotton, probably Marco Rubio again.
Mike Pence.
Certainly Mike Pence. Probably, I would think there may be some House members who will want to run. There may be another governor or two. I think you can easily come up with a list of a dozen Republicans who would run. As I said it before, the interesting question is which of those people will run if Donald Trump is running. If he doesn't run, it's it's a Katie bar the door kind of moment.
So back to my final question, which is, as you research the book, what surprised you the most? What did you learn that you did not know going into this project?
I think what surprised me most, and I made a reference to this before, was how central immigration has been to the political debate in the country and particularly within the Republican Party. That, I think we all knew, I certainly knew, we should have all known that immigration was a big and potent issue. But it is in many ways the fulcrum on which the move from traditional conservatism to populism has moved in this country over the last 40 years. It's a big deal. And I think there's a lot of ugly nativist anti-immigrant sentiment out there, which I find offensive. But you also have to admit that, when the number of undocumented workers went from 8 to 12 million over a period of just a few years, that was scary to a lot of people. I guess the second thing that surprised me was how fond I was of Ronald Reagan in retrospect, how principled he was, and how self-assured he was, and how much that combination, principled and self-assured, makes for a good leader. I had mixed feelings about Reagan when he was president, and a lot of people did, I suppose. And I had the same questions other people. Was this guy really intellectually up to the job? But I think I came to appreciate how a combination of real principles, knowing what you believe in, and a kind of a gentle, winning personality makes for a pretty good leader.
And one of the great tragedies is because of his Alzheimer's, he really didn't have much of a post-presidency to cement that image himself personally.
No, and you know, an interesting thing that I'd forgotten about entirely until I did the book was that he was slipping toward Alzheimer's even I think in his final days in office. And in retrospect, you could see that he had a bad fall from a horse when he was horse riding, which he loved to do, obviously, about 6 months after he left office. And I think in retrospect, his family concluded that that fall helped speed up the advance of Alzheimer's, and is one of the reasons there wasn't, as you suggest, much of a post-presidency.
A fabulous book. We should have seen it coming, from Reagan to Trump, a front row seat to a political revolution. The executive editor of the Wall Street Journal, and Gerald Seib. Next best thing is we'll have you come to Erie and meet the wonderful people of the community in the future. But on behalf of the Jefferson Education Society and Northwest Pennsylvania, thank you very much for participating in this conversation. It was fabulous.
Thank you. My pleasure. And I'm happy to be in Erie anytime.
You'll be invited. Trust me.
Thank you.
Seib, thank you. Round of applause from all of the people who are watching virtually. Thank you.
Absolutely. To our guest tonight, Mr. Gerald Seib, author of the critically acclaimed We Should Have Seen It Coming, From Reagan to Trump, a front row seat to a political revolution, and the executive Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for sharing your insights and knowledge with us. And we can't wait to invite you to Erie, Pennsylvania to have an in-person event. And of course, thanks to Mr. Steve Scully, the chairman of the JES's Global Summit Speaker Series, for moderating tonight's lively and thought-provoking conversation. And of course, thanks goes out to our entire JES team under the leadership of our president, Dr. Ferki Faradi, and to the JES Board of Trustees under the leadership of our chairwoman, Joyce Savacchio, and to all of our event sponsors, Erie Insurance, Erie News Now, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, WQLM Public Media, and the American Tapestry Project, and to our Global Summit event partner, the City Club of Cleveland. And of course, to all of you watching along at home, thank you for tuning in. These programs and discussions and the exchange of information and ideas would not be possible without you. Folks, for more information about the JES, including how to register for additional global summits, which you see on your screen right now, please visit jeserie.org. You'll also find a link on how and where to purchase Gerald Seib's critically acclaimed book, We Should Have Seen It Coming, From Reagan to Trump, a front row seat to a political revolution. There you're also going to find videos of past presentations available to stream on demand, and publications, including reports, essays, and timely writings, as well as information about other JES initiatives, such as our Civic Leadership Academy and Ramey Fellows program. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.